Hello, my name is Kate Mildenhall and I'm an author. This is my most recent book, The Mother Fault, which is published by Simon & Schuster. And The Mother Fault is really the story of Mim. So it begins in a near future Australia, frighteningly like the one that we are in right now. And Mim is a mother of two. She's been at home for the last 10 years. She's a geologist. And it opens when her husband, who's a FIFO worker working in a mine in Indonesia, has gone missing. And from there, we follow as Mim becomes increasingly distressed that she doesn't know where he is. In this near future Australia, we are governed by one department, just called the department, and they very quickly get on board to tell Mim that she should shelter in place with her children and not to make a fuss. And she goes on to do what I think probably any good mother would do, and she takes off with the kids to try and keep them safe. So it's a road trip, it's a sailing trip, it's a bit of a love story, it's a thriller, it's got everything kind of thrown in the mix. The idea for this book came probably about 5 years ago now. My children at that stage were 5 and 3, so I was deep in the throes of kinder drop-offs and grappling with my new life, which didn't necessarily involve work and the kinds of things that I'd had before. And I was going between, as many parents would, the feeling of utter adoration for my children, knowing that I would do anything to protect them or for them, at the same time as some days wanting to scream into the pillow for a very long time and shut myself in my room. So there was that feeling, and at the same time politically in Australia and all around the world, we were deep in that kind of a time of asylum seekers who are obviously still coming, but there was great political debate. I was so angry with the way our government was treating asylum seekers, and I was reading all of those stories constantly of parents, mothers who were forced to make these terrible, impossible decisions to try and keep their families safe. And so it was that tension, those two ideas kind of crashing up against each other, which is often what happens for writers, that started me writing this book. It's not my first book. My first book is called Skylarking, and completely different as they possibly could be. Skylarking is a work of historical fiction. It's based on a true story that I stumbled across literally while I was camping with my kids. And as my first book, I had just returned to study writing. I didn't even know I was writing a novel. So it was this gift of a novel and such an incredible experience. But at the end of it, I was surprised that the expectation on me then as a writer was to write more historical fiction, because I hadn't seen myself as a historical fiction writer necessarily. I just followed the story. So as also a somewhat stubborn person, I decided to go as far as I could in the opposite direction and do, this speculative dystopian thriller instead. Why do I write? It is something that has always given me joy, and it did as a young person, and I wrote so much, and then I stopped because it wasn't a job. Enough people told me that I wouldn't get published and that it wasn't a proper thing to do that I stopped. But when my first child was born, I think I wrote a poem to her, scribbled it in my journal the very first night in hospital. And it was like this visceral need to start writing again. And so over the course of the next couple of years, when my second daughter was born as well, I went back to the course that I wanted to do when I was in year 12 that my teachers told me, smart girls didn't do. And I did that exact course and started writing again. And I love it. I don't know that I could do anything else. I feel like I am my most me when I'm on the page. 2020, I feel extremely lucky in many ways that I got to release The Mother Fault. It came out in September in 2020. We were deep in lockdown, a second lockdown here in Melbourne. But there was such incredible generosity and joy that I felt around me, because people just couldn't believe. My friends, not necessarily my writer friends, but my friends who were like, you were going to go on planes this year. You were going to go on tour. And so I had, balloons and flowers delivered and lots of booze, and it was all really marvelous. And I didn't, like many people did at the start of the year, many debut novelists as well, have their tours cancelled, because mine just never got off the ground because it was such a strange year. It was really strange releasing a book like The Mother Fault in 2020, because I felt really conscious that I'd projected this vision of a world with total surveillance, where there was enormous distrust in the government, where the idea was to rebel and reject what the government was asking its citizens to do. And yet here we were in this crisis kind of emergency, and I was conscious of not being lumped in with conspiracy theorists as well with the book. So that was an interesting kind of conversation to be having at the same time. And in terms of my writing colleagues, the other books that were released, I am so excited this year to see writers back out in the world, doing what you're doing here, going to festivals, getting to meet readers. The biggest regret I think that many of them had was that they didn't get to have that face-to-face time with readers. Having said that, I think our industry, the book industry, did an incredible job of still having people reading, having people talking about their books. Readers came on board. That was all incredible. At the moment, I am a full-time writer, which is a gorgeously luxurious thing to say in Australia, and for any writer. I, also have 2 school-age kids, so a lot of it is around that. And I encompass in that full-time writing the other stuff I do as part of the industry, and that might be interviewing other writers, that might be working on the First Time podcast, which I do with my colleague Catherine Collette, where we interview Australian writers, which is fantastic. Reading books, doing teaching gigs, all of that kind of work is part of the work of a writer now. But in terms of being able to sit down and write my next book, last week I had the luxury of a week on retreat without my children, and one gets a lot of work done when they can write from 6 until 6 and then not think about having to do the rest of life. So many great books came out in 2020. The one that is my go-to recommendation has been Claire Christian's It's Been a Pleasure, Noni Blake, which I just recommended to so many people because I read it so quickly. It was so fun and sexy and great, and I think she's just terrific, so I loved that. Some other ones that I think flew really under the radar at the start of the year, Imbi Neem's The Spill, which I thought was just structurally so excellent. Also Mandy Beaumont's Wild Fearless Chess, which really is a book that is speaking to this moment right now and women's rage as well, I think. Kokomo, Victoria Hannon's Kokomo was a real favourite too. Just, I think if people go back through the 2020 list of releases and just try and tick off as many as you possibly can. I am, like so many other writers, I am an Anne of Green Gables absolute diehard fan, and I remember reading it in grade 1, and my grade 1 teacher telling my mum and dad that someone should put a basketball in my hands because I was reading a little too much. And the most gorgeous thing, Katie, is that I very recently got an email from that grade 1 teacher who had just read The Mother Fault and was wishing to congratulate me. So I thought that was a gorgeous kind of full circle. But yeah, Anne of Green Gables, which was a huge influence for me with skylarking as well. And we had so many books in the house. We're just very lucky. My parents are both teachers and we were just sodden with books. And I'm trying to do the same for my daughters now. Next, very excitingly, I am going back to historical fiction. Didn't plan it that way, but that's the book that came to me. So I am deep in the work for that, and it's just a joy. For The Mother Fault, the research took me sailing on a yacht from Darwin to Indonesia, which was kind of mad, but wonderful. And the research for this one is taking me into butcher shops and abattoirs. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for having me. I love this project from the Leaf Bookshop.